I want to start things off very quickly. You've all got your mics, so no worries, you won't need to share. I'd love to ask you, what do we mean? I mean, can we honestly be that Asian hub of innovation? Is Singapore the answer to that question? I'll start with you, Steve, if I may.
Yeah, I define this thing just like I don't think of Asia, I don't think of Europe, I think of countries and markets and different things happening. So when the question is, where is the hub of innovation? I don't know how to answer that because I think everybody has innovation in different ways. So can Singapore be innovative? Singapore is, I think as we heard through some of the commentary, innovative just based on water generation, based on food, based on a lot of things that Singapore has had to work with and overcome over the course of its development. So for me, if I move away from this narrow definition of is it this or is it that, I think Singapore has done a lot of innovative things. And I think this concept of whether there is a center of innovation, I think we should focus more on what can we do as opposed to a center or some other center.
What can we do? Bruno, do we know what we can do as a hub of innovation?
Clearly, as Steve just mentioned, Singapore is doing a number of things right already. But there's always more than can be done in the area of innovation. Innovation is a competition. So the innovator is not just the one who innovates, but the one who innovates faster than its competitors. So agility is a critical asset. And this is where, as Yini mentioned, where size can be an advantage. It's easier to be agile when you're small than when you're bigger. So this kind of relativity of the factors of production, how you arrange them, whether you use your size to attract talent in particular, all that exists, but it needs to be built on. It's never one forever.
Okay, let me play devil's advocate. We seem to always be saying, we've got it, we've got everything else, it's there, the infrastructure is there, the support is there, the funding is there if you look for it. The people are, don't know how many % graduates in Singapore, we've got the stuff, it's there, but how come it just hasn't come together or coalesced very nicely? Lawrence, what do you think? I mean, are we on the tipping point? Are we there yet, or are we still far away from that?
I think we have a lot of potential, but we are definitely not there. I come from the social innovation space, the space that Bernice comes from. And the reason why I think innovation is so important for our country is because we have growing needs. And to me, innovation is about meeting needs, whether today or tomorrow. And we're not meeting those needs enough, and in a way that can bring us to the future. And it's beyond that, it's beyond meeting needs. It's about the community and the citizens taking ownership of social issues and the community issues and being part of the solution. And we're not seeing enough of that either in Singapore. Let me just give you a data point. The number of new charities that were registered in 2002, that's 10 years ago, was 167. The number of new charities registered last year was 55. 167 to 55. Just one data point to illustrate that that's a 2/3 reduction. So where are these innovators? They're gone. They've gone to cushy jobs and banks in,
It's always the bank
MNC.
that's cushy for some reason.
Sorry, I shouldn't just bash banks, but Singapore is a full employment situation, as one of our speakers mentioned. There are a lot of alternatives for people who are entrepreneurs or innovators, and I think that's a critical issue, the human resource issue, but also the mindset. Why innovate? Why take the risky path when there's a more settled path to go, and make your money?
We've got the right guy to ask about that. Urs, tell us about that. Why support the risky venture? I mean, would a venture capitalist see it that way as well?
I very much agree with Lawrence just said. It's a problem, and where I come from Switzerland, we're very similar to Singapore, I think. We're also a very small country. We also are sitting there very comfortable. Mm-hmm. And a lot of young people, they decide, good people, they just go to McKinsey and they go to the banks, probably like here. But I think it's important to make this mind change that great people, they do their own business and they start their own startup. So I think that's very important, and reflecting your question also on the venture capital side, who finance then those ideas, these innovations, I also see a very big difference in mindset between the US, that is mostly told as the innovative place, and probably Singapore and Switzerland and many places in Europe that VCs, they tend in Europe not to invest in people that already failed once. And whereas in the US, people and investors, they are much less risk averse in a way. So they say if they already failed once or twice, but not with their money, they're going to invest in them because they don't do the same mistakes anymore and they learned from their failure before.
Can you fail here and in Switzerland, do you think?
I think it's much more difficult to fail and still be accepted and get another chance. Whereas in the US, I think to fail is part of the learning. Stand up and do it better the next time. And I think the VCs and the ones who finance the business think exactly the same way. And I'm not so sure how it is in Singapore. You're the experts here. But that's what I see in Europe, and that's what is a big difference to the US.
Steve, I saw you nodding along to what he was saying. Tell us your view on that.
I think we don't have everything that we need here. So I think we have a lot of the ingredients, but
what's missing?
Back to some of the points that have been touched on. We don't have enough support for taking risk. And I don't mean support as in government support or let's all say that we'd like everybody to try harder. I just think that the idea of taking a risk, moving out of something comfortable. I met with a student that had some really great academic credentials, has a great internship at a multinational tech company, would like to be starting up a business, but his point to me was, how can I go home and say, I'm going to leave this great internship with this multinational and go to some startup? So it is a challenge. It's not something that I know personally how to try and solve through a program. So I love the example of Vicky, which is, let's try something. Equity doesn't make any difference. And I've heard this from friends of mine that have startups. The answer is, well, when we get more Vickies where there's more exits and people make money on equity, equity will start to matter. So we need some of just a little bit of pump priming. So I think we're kind of stuck a little bit right now in this idea of what more schemes, what more programs, as opposed to celebrating more actively, more proactively, the exits like Travel Mob or Vicky or YFind that are examples of what can happen. And then have kids be excited. We don't have enough kids going into tech. We don't have enough kids going into computer science and engineering. So the issue isn't whether we have enough foreign talent or not enough foreign talent, is we need more of our own homegrown talent. And right now, part of that is for kids to have something to be excited about working on. We were at the Google Mountain View campus talking with a number of Singaporean engineers who have decided that's where their great challenge is. We need to create more opportunities for engineers to be excited about right here. So I think it would be wrong for us to say we have everything. We have a lot of the raw ingredients, but this sort of secret sauce is to celebrate more of the exits and then create more enthusiasm and excitement and energy. I think we're on the cusp, but we're not there yet.
I want to open it up to the crowd. So, old-fashioned way, hands up. If you have a question or comment or want to participate. Anyone? Where are my 10 hands? No? See, it always takes that first person. It's like being back in school. Once the first person asks their question, then all ask. So when the first person is ready, let me know. Shout out in the corner of my ear. Oh, we've got somebody in the front. Yes, go ahead. Now the floodgates open.
I just want to ask, we talked about the point about taking risk and it being, a badge of honor to fail in Silicon Valley. Now here in Singapore, lots of the first round of funding in the startup stage really comes from the government. So the question is, accepting that people learn from failure, but how comfortable is the government in funding people who've already failed once? Can they take that Silicon Valley lesson?
So I won't speak on behalf of this sort of thing called government. I'll speak on behalf of IDA. And IDA is happy, right? IDA wants to be involved in making a difference. IDA wants to help make something important possible. So we have an investment arm called IIPL, so investments, and we have an ability to invest in companies directly or in partnership with other funders. So the answer is, if somebody says, here's the lessons that I've learned, here's the experiences that I've gained, that's great. So in the 10-second testimonial, I ran a company in Mountain View. That company worked for about a year. We ended up getting investors about 90% of their cash, decided we couldn't get where we wanted to go, so we decided to part friends and go do something new. I learned a lot from that experience. It wasn't a lot of fun, but I learned a lot from that experience, and therefore I feel like I would be a better person as a result of that than if I'd gone into something and had a Midas touch, although I'd like to be able to have a Midas touch someday. But from that perspective, I would personally empathize more with people that said, here's the lesson. Now the difference, Anne, would be if somebody comes in and says, hey, I blew it, I wasn't paying that much attention, the market moved, you know, sort of, here's the reasons why it wasn't my fault, then I wouldn't be very excited. If somebody came in and said, here's what I didn't do right, I learned some important lessons, I do it differently next time, and here's how, I'd say, that's great. So I'll speak on behalf of IDA.
Floor is open. If you have any questions, raise your hand. If not, I'm going to pick up on the next point, which is something you mentioned, Steve, which I want to bring up with Bruno, which is the idea of the right talent, and getting the right people and getting engineers excited and whatnot. You were talking to me about how you look at what innovation is, and talent really stands out as one of the biggest determinants. How do we fare?
Well, there are two ways of looking at the talent you need. One way is what I call the absolute definition of talent. What we heard already from previous speakers, okay, there's not enough engineers here, there's not enough IT people. What Steve just mentioned, the local system has to grow this kind of talent. That's what I call the absolute definition. That is, you say, we have this category, that category, that category. And then there's a relative definition of talent. And if you want to be innovative, you need some kind of different talent, differentiated talent. You also need combinations of talent. So I think it's more and more difficult to identify a talented, innovative individual. But you can create talented, innovative groups, companies, enterprises. And you have to combine different kinds of talents, of backgrounds. The diversity becomes a critical element. And this is where Singapore has a definite advantage. Switzerland has a definitive advantage. Being small countries, having mixed different cultures. Switzerland has 4 official languages. This is an advantage. You create diversity from the start. I'd like to also mention something about the right to fail, the ability to fail, because I think it's a critical cultural factor that differentiates, for instance, Europe from the US. In Europe, it is almost forbidden to fail. You want to create a new company, the first thing you have to do is to create a bank account, to have a bank account. When you want to have a bank account, the first piece of paper you sign is you certified on your honor, at least in my country, in France, that you've never been bankrupt. Now imagine what it means, okay, in terms of creativity, stimulating entrepreneurship. Finland, which is another champion. The 3 champions in our ranking of innovation have been, if you look at the last 10 years, typically Switzerland, Singapore, Sweden. And you say, well, you look at that, and an economist would say, oh, that's proof that to be innovative, you have to be small and have a name starting with an S. This is not our main conclusion. But Finland, for instance, which is another champion, has decided 2 years ago to have a national day to celebrate failure. That is, in companies, in government entities, you say, what has been our biggest failure this year? Okay? And people said, oh, I failed doing that. Our team has failed doing that. And they open a bottle of champagne. So that's very good for French exports. We encourage it all over the world. But the fact is, you need respect for failure. Not to repeat it, but to have what we call falling forward. You fail, but you fail forward. You make progress, but that is where government have a role to play. Because it's a cultural issue, it's a long-term issue. It implies the banks, it implies a number of people, it implies education. It starts very early. Not love failure, but have respect for failure.
Lawrence, can we do that here? Especially for grassroots social enterprises, the mark and the stigma of the failure, could it hamper your funding in future or your networks with the agencies that you need?
You see, I think failing is becoming more accepted in Singapore, although it still isn't by and large. But the attitude towards failure is telling. Quite often it's like, I failed with my enterprise, now I join a bank. Okay.
Yeah,
I joined the bank, I joined a consultancy.
Who's the banks? Any bankers here? I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm in the bank bashing mode. It's not. I failed. That gives me a lot of data about what I'm doing, and I will change my plan to make it into something that will succeed. So that resilience, I think, is not there. That ability to work on the ground, I mean, like Bernice is, to really understand the customers, the beneficiaries, the consumers, is not there. Now, I also run on behalf of government a grant scheme. It's called the New Initiative Grant. And we almost never give out the entire budget because we don't get enough good proposals. I think in Singapore, you have a lot of funds sitting on the sidelines because they cannot find good proposals. And it's not that there are no applications. It's when the applicants come, it's quite evident that they are coming with a product in mind without any idea whether there's a demand, there's a market. They've done very little research. They've certainly not even heard of ethnography, let alone done it. Where are the skill sets? It's not just talent. You also need to equip these talented people with the skills and the mindset to go out and create solutions that really meet needs on the ground.
Can I add something to acceptance to fail? I think this really starts in every company at every level as well, and this is very important. As successful companies, I think they have a culture of failure as well. So everyone in the company is allowed to fail and to make mistakes. And I think that's very, very important. And Jean-Claude Beaver, who made Hublot and Blancpain, the company, he told me lately that they, on a regular basis, they invited the whole top management and everyone had to bring his 3 biggest failures in the last period. And then they discussed it. And so he said, we met every 3 months, 5 people, 50 mistakes, blah, blah, blah. And now we have 100 mistakes. We can't fail anymore. We have discussed all mistakes. And I think it's just already. A very, very open attitude to failure for everyone in the company, from the beginner, intern to the top management. And you have to share, even as a boss or as a CEO, you have to share your failures as well. And many people don't do that. And I think that's also a source for not being successful then.
Does that strike a chord with you? If you're starting your own company, if you're running your own company, do you think that that is a limitation that is imposed upon you, the stigma of failure, understanding the culture of where you are? I'm opening it up to the floor as well. Any points to raise? Raise your hand. Yes, sir, in the corner. Oh, ma'am, I beg your pardon. Sir, beg your pardon.
Hi.
Go for it, yeah.
Yeah, so my question is about exams culture. So, we have a heavy emphasis on being really good at our exams in Singapore. But at the same time, is it possible that that same heavy emphasis on grades, which has led to our grade efficiency at doing all these things, at odds with innovation? Because I have friends in school in Singapore who purposely intend to take the least risky courses. When I was in school, my dad says, don't take the difficult courses. Take the ones you know you can score in, which may not be the ones that you're really interested in. So, is the exams culture at odds with innovation?
Let me ask you, what do you think? I mean, amongst your peers, is there a risk factor? Are people not wanting to take the risk?
I say it depends on the parents.
Every show I do, it comes back to parents, Yes, follow up, Bernice.
So just to build on Sean's point, I agree, parents have a lot to do with it, especially in Singapore. So this is not just a structural issue, it's also a cultural one, where you are supposed to live with your parents until you get married. And then up to that point, your decisions about career is a lot to do with what they think is best for you. And well, you could say screw it, right? But in my case, it wasn't the case.
Wait, are we building down the line of innovation through the cost of HDB prices, the lack of renters culture, and parental structures now?
Well, it's a related point, right? So I was going to say, I used to, before I came and did this startup with Sean, Sean's my co-founder actually, I used to work in a private equity firm, and it wasn't my first choice, and my parents wanted me to do it, and so I did it, and I found that I learned a lot in the process, but I also learned that, you know, what your parents think is right for you may or may not always pan out, but, you know, you kind of make the choice yourself in the end, and you decide to live with it. And for me, it turned out to be an okay thing, and I don't know how it turns out for everyone else.
Thank you for sharing, Bernice. I appreciate that. I want to move on to another aspect as well, this idea of, we're talking a lot about fostering innovation, and how do we foster innovation, but does that very concept, fostering innovation, also serve to limit it or stifle it in some way? Because some people are trying to give their own definitions or give their own criteria to what innovation is. Let me open it up to the panel. By trying to foster it, are we stifling it as well in some way? I'll say Noah.
Yes, definitely yes. And very often with the best of intentions. I think what we just heard about grades is a perfect example. The education system operates through grades, and the teachers with the best intention will try to use the grades to encourage people. So say, you can do better. You know, you get a C minus, maybe that can be moved into a C plus. This is where the notion of relativity of grades comes into play. But there is an assumption in private and public organization that the incentives you use to stimulate innovation are the same you use to get people excited about working for your company or your department. Actually, innovators, and this is something we live every day at INSEAD, where we're supposed to help create innovators, respond to different kinds of incentives. Wages, salaries are a relatively minor part of it. Status is also a relatively minor part of it. What motivates an innovator is peer recognition, if they are in an academic field, and its success as self-defined. That is, I'm trying something, I'm succeeding or I'm not succeeding, but I want this to be recognized by myself and people I consider like my peers. So the psychological mechanics is fairly more complex than what we are used to use. So to a large extent, the incentives we use to attract innovators are very often counterproductive. If you want, as a country, for instance, to be a hub for innovation, what you need to reach is critical mass. That is, when your place is known, and it can be a city, it can be a county, it can even be a suburb somewhere, if that place is known as a place where innovators are, more innovators are going to gather around it.
But to be that place, ideas need to flourish and flow freely, some would say. And if there are too narrow definitions, let's say you want to apply for an innovation fund, and the criteria is you must show that technology is the main driving force. In itself, that is limiting because innovation doesn't necessarily have to be tied to technology, does it? I mean, do ideas flow freely enough if there are limitations set by the structures around you?
Sorry.
I was just going to say that it depends, I mean, back to your original question of whether you can foster innovation, it depends on how you do it. In the typical context in Singapore, we overstructure it, we over-educate, we over-plan, and it's very top-down, and we get married to innovative ideas. I think in innovation, we must bet more on the individual, on the person, rather than the ideas and the products, and support that person in various ways. One, in connecting the person to people, you know, to mentors, to coaches, to people that he or she does not normally encounter, that can help develop him, her, and the ideas more. People in social innovation tend to be, as I mentioned just now, very disconnected, you know, or very alone, and they need not be so. So how do you create that ecosystem of people coming together to work on common problems? And also to support one another, because it can be very lonely. It can be, you're up against parents who are telling you, you know, what on earth are you doing? You just quit your private equity job, you know, you're doing something that's so risky. You need to, so that entire ecosystem, I think, can be nurtured and the culture fostered to support innovation.
But let's think about one of the best examples of innovation that everybody knows about. Bell Labs in the US over an extended number of years was one of the major sources of innovation. So if you think about things like the transistor chip or radar or a number of different things. But it's also the antithesis of structured innovation. The whole thing about Bell Labs was people that were there were not in the mathematician's row and the chemist row or the floor for the metallurgist. The whole idea was mash people together that had different disciplines, lots of long corridors so that people generally had to walk from one place to the other and risk or encourage the idea that there was unintended meetings and impromptu meetings. So for anybody that's interested, if you take a quick look back at the transistor that ultimately changed a lot of things in the world, it wasn't one team. It was metallurgist and chemist and a whole bunch of different guys thinking about the role of silicon and lots of different materials. So from that perspective, I think if we think of this as how can we structure it, how can we foster it, I do think we risk this idea. What I think we can do is try and create some environment that is supportive or conducive, to think of that sort of a context. So same thing with PARC, the Palo Alto research. If you think of lots of different areas, just like Block 71 here, the whole idea is put people that have some relatively common interests and then get out of the way. So if we spend too much time trying to control the levers and switches and knobs, then we do end up over-egging it. But I don't think it's a matter of staying completely out of the way and hoping for the best. So my sense of it would be create the square edges of a major box, and then once all those ingredients are roughly within an environment, get out of the way.
Balance between control and freedom, but that's very tenuous to reach sometimes for people if the culture is not there.
Yeah, but without going too far on it, the whole idea is Singapore is pumping, as Chairman said, billions into exciting areas of research. Tons of things going on. Anybody in the room that's already in education or finished, NTU, SUTD, NUS, SMU with Living Labs, there's a lot of things going on around healthcare and analytics and energy and all kinds of cool things. So there isn't a lack of ideas and interest. There's money floating around. We have more money than we possibly could use, right? It's not a lack of money. But what's not happening, to Lawrence's point, is not enough great ideas meeting motivated money. So we have motivated money that sort of lost interest because not enough great ideas coming forward. So you get these sort of half-baked, not very well thought through ideas, and our credibility then, I'm saying our collectively, credibility takes a hit. You know, active money moves somewhere else looking for an opportunity to be used. So there's a lot of opportunities for us, and I don't think we have to do a lot, but I do think there's some things that we can choose to do, some things around networking and supporting things like this big tent event. But the whole idea is partly the reason the Valley works is people are recycling. They're in their third or fourth startup. As Kent was saying, you get spin-offs. So somebody makes it, goes off and starts their own thing, just like when you propagate a plant. You cut it and cut it and cut it, and it grows and spreads. We don't have enough of that. So when somebody sells and then moves on and doesn't reinvest or recycle, that's a problem for the system. There's nothing special about the Valley other than just a compressed area in which a lot of smart money and a lot of smart people and a lot of ideas and an ability to go nuts all coexist. For those that have ever walked up and down University Avenue in Palo Alto, you can go to a coffee shop and hear 5 business plans by just sitting still for 15 minutes. So the question would be, where do we have something like that?
Opening it up to the floor. Microphone?
I'm going to speak here from a taxpayer's point of view, so not as an innovator. I've always wondered about the government funding for various projects, whether it's a NRF or A-Star or Spring and God knows what have you. And every time you hear about several billions, millions and all that sort of funds for certain sectors. I've always wanted to know, how does the government account to taxpayers for the use of this money and what has been the results of it? As I said, I'm being very practical here. I know some money will go into a black hole somewhere, but it seems to me we are never-endingly launching funds and trying to, throw money to hit a sweet spot somewhere. So how do you find this balance between justifying the use of these funds and making sure there are some tangible outcomes?
Funders, I leave the floor to you all. Steve, you want to take the lead on that?
I don't mind. I don't know whether. Okay. So my perspective on it is that there's lots and lots of risk in something like putting funding into research projects, just like everything in the world. There's nothing special about Singapore in the sense of you take a risk, sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't, because that's how great things occur. If we think about where Singapore has made huge strides, biomedical, there's some really exciting things happening there. When we think about areas with energy, things around nanotech, graphene, there's some really cool things going on. For those that haven't had a chance to spend time looking it up, the graphene lab up at NUS is doing some very cool things, and graphene as a single molecular layer is the strongest, lightest material currently known. So there's things around water purification, aerospace, lots of stuff. And Singapore is leading a lot of the areas around the research of this material that's going to have use cases around the world. It is a concern always to make sure that there's accountability and that those dollars are going into places that yield real outcomes. And it was in the press, so it's not like I'm breaking any news, that there was a big meeting last week chaired by PM talking about all of these areas and how we can continue to sharpen the focus, how we can continue to work on these areas so that they're yielding real outcomes. I don't think there's any challenge, I personally don't think there's any challenge on is the money going into areas that are exciting and innovative and will yield real outcomes for Singapore citizens, Singapore taxpayers. I think the big challenge for us is to continue to think about these on a bigger platform, which is, are we able to solve problems that are exciting and important for Singapore, but also exciting and important for people around the world? Because that's where the big companies come from, that's where the big job creators come from, that's where the big economic value creators come from. And the best example that I love to share in these kinds of scenarios, the one that I understand most, would be HyFlux, which is working on a problem that was important to Singapore, but went on to solve problems that were important for countries around the world. And the intersection that made HyFlux even more innovative was combining water and power. So the intersection of water and power made HyFlux even more important. Now, some of that was an outcome of some raw research and some applied research. So what I can say is there's always a concern to ensure, is it leading to something? I think, candidly, part of our challenge is just doing a good job communicating where some of this research is yielding exciting results, because I don't think it's well enough known, and the challenge is to make sure that it does lead to exciting results. So there was a very specific alignment, clarification, recommitment, reprioritization that took place just last week, and I think there was some press coverage on that on Friday afternoon.
Bruno, something to add?
Yeah, just on this point, because I think it's a very legitimate question. When we talk about the possible involvement of the public sector, of government, who is responsible? That is, what is the ROI? And I would encourage anybody in government and elsewhere who wants to support innovation to actually make a very big difference between two kinds of ROIs. There is the return on investment and there's a return on innovation. And you cannot infer that your financial and accounting techniques for innovation will apply. This means taking risk, which is not the strong point of the public sector. But I would argue that we have many examples, and Singapore is a place where we see that happen, where public sector innovation has ceased to be an oxymoron. Coming back to the previous point and to quote a very precise example of what governments can do and how they generate return on innovation. To the previous point about how do you actually create innovation, I would say you cannot describe a phenomenon by which you put together some ingredients and say if you put that together, enough funding, enough good people, enough structure, enough market, you're going to have an innovative hub. That would be chemistry. Innovation is closer to alchemy. There is somewhere a factor that we cannot identify. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't work. It's magic somewhere. Taking that into account, the best you can do is to create what I call engineered serendipity. Is you create the conditions to make sure that people would have no reasons to meet, get together, share ideas, and this is where the spark of innovation comes. I often use the following phrase comparing campuses in Europe to campuses in the US. Most innovation does not happen in the lab, it happens in the cafeteria. Okay? The cafeteria is the place where you're sitting with your tray, you're studying electronic engineering, and you have on your right somebody who will study comparative languages, and on your left somebody who studies ancient Greek philosophy. And conversations start, and this is the real root of innovation. So technology can be a big part of it, but just thinking differently, looking at the world differently, wearing a tie in a podium in a Google meeting, it just shows that you don't have to feel uncomfortable about it.
Or that you have French flair.
That's an explanation. Everybody has their limitation. But it's like coming to a horse race with a bicycle, okay? So somehow it's going to be different. You have to accept that. The point is that governments have a role to play in there. Finland, which is a small country I quoted before, took a major decision about 5 years ago. They took the best business school, the best engineering school, the best design school. Those 3 schools were receiving government subsidies. And the government said, from now on, people, you're not going to receive any subsidy from the government, 30% of the budget off, except if you work together. That is, we want people who will graduate, they will major in one of the 3 and minor in the other 2. In other words, we want engineers that come from the top engineering school, they will have a minor in business and a minor in design, and vice versa. Mix them as you want, and you keep receiving the subsidies. They call this consortium ALTO, with a double A, so they are very high in the alphabetical order. And ALTO's graduates started to be churned out 2 years ago. They are receiving the highest salary of any graduate school all over Europe. So clearly, it fits a demand. It fits a demand for multicultural, multisectoral kind of training. This is something Singapore can do. You have high-level management school, you have high-level engineering school, you have top research in bio nanotechnology. This can be engineered serendipity.
That is one unique suggestion.
Daniel, just let me add on the question of holding government accountable for R&D spending. One macro measure that is quite typically used is looking at the ratio of public expenditure on R&D to business expenditure on R&D. You want that ratio to be at least 1 to 2 or even better. Unfortunately, so for every dollar that you spend on public R&D, you want at least $2 in commercial firms doing the R&D. Unfortunately, I think that number has been coming down over the last 3 years in Singapore, so that's something that we need to be quite concerned about.
Both any follow-up? Floor is open. In the back.
Hi. Singapore is well known for being a very rules-based society. Every time I travel abroad, people say, "Hey, you can't chew gum, you can't crosswalk, you can't do anything like that."
The chewing gum is outdated. You find a new one, but that one, you're okay.
But anyway, I think one of the interesting things about technology is that it's very disruptive, and it sort of messes with rules. It pushes the boundaries of rules. I look at startups like Uber, Lyft, things like Airbnb, even Google with their self-driving car and glass and these types of technologies. Does Singapore have enough flexibility with rules, or are there too many rules that are preventing innovation from happening at a larger scale?
Panel.
I think it's also a question of diversity you have to bring together. If you bring enough people from like different cultures, from like what we have in Switzerland, so if you bring them together, then you get other ideas as well, and you get the questions where people question themselves or question their peers. Why are you doing it like that? Why do you pay the fine if you have a chewing gum on the floor? I mean, why not put more garbage bags there or whatever? So I think this really fosters innovation if you bring diversity together to look at such problems.
Bruno, are we too rules-based? Are we inflexible?
Yeah, I have a rather, I think, non-conventional view of rules. I think that rules can stimulate creativity. I would take the example of poetry. If you take the English sonnet, for instance, it has an incredible number of rules in terms of what you need to alternate rhymes, the lengths of the verses, etc. It has given birth to some of the most creative poetry you can see in all languages. Same for haiku in Japanese, etc. So you have very strict rules, and it can still stimulate creativity because it encourages people to get around the rules. So if you don't specify everything, That is, if you limit the field of creativity, etc., clearly it doesn't work. But having some rules saying you can do that, you cannot do that, etc., may not be an obstacle to creativity, on the contrary.
Or is picking up on his point of this idea of too many rules, and people have the perception maybe of doing business in Singapore, even though we do see that it's so-called, once again, the best place to do business in the world, according to WHO's competitive survey that was just out today. If that perception exists, will it prevent money and investors from coming into our startups and venture capitalists like you, if they think it's too hard and too many rules?
I don't think that this is a problem for a venture capitalist. If there is, like, venture capitalists usually look at the product, at the market. If the market is big enough, if you have probably a solution which is only, what you said before, only valid for Singapore, then probably you wouldn't invest as an investor from abroad. But if you solve a problem which is a global problem, or like in a bigger market, you wouldn't say, well, the regulations are too narrow in Singapore and I'm not investing there. Absolutely not. I don't think so.
A good idea is a good idea. A money-making idea is a money-making idea.
Daniel, I just wanted to quickly answer the question. Sometimes it's not that there are too many rules. It's people, and I talk from the social innovation space, people are always looking to the government for permission. Right? And charities are always looking to the government and say, can I do this? And if the answer is no, then they won't do it. And you look at the charity and you ask them.
That's the end of that idea.
Why is it the end of the idea? Why can't you raise your own funding? Why can't you do it on your own reserves? Just because the government refuses to fund it, why don't you still do it if you are so convicted about it? But a lot of people will just drop it and say, oh, it's too difficult. So we really do need true innovators and entrepreneurs say, no, I mean, if you don't like the idea, I'll still do it if I'm really convicted about it. And I think we need to support those people.
I also think it's important that although you have a lot of rules, you still allow people to think. So if you compare it to the military, where every Swiss has to go to the military, there are a lot of rules there as well, but you're not really asked to think there. So there is no innovative ideas during that time. Whereas in your normal life, although there are a lot of rules, but you're faster to think, then you come up with ideas to get around those rules, probably, as you said, or to make things in a different way, which this rule does not apply, or to make it just different. So I think it's important that you motivate people to think.
Can I offer one quick perspective on this?
Of course.
I first moved here at the end of '97. So whenever somebody asks me about this when I travel around, the simplest thing for me is, if anybody does not like the Singapore that is, then I'd be surprised. Meaning, whatever the rules or changes, and I've seen certainly since I first moved here, a lot more quote-unquote flexibility or opening up. But from my perspective, what Singapore is now, and all the comforts everybody enjoys, and the fact that I certainly have a lot of people from around the world saying, I'm happy to be in Singapore, I would like to be there, I would like to set up my business there, I'd like to have an opportunity to see and learn. So I kind of scratch my head a little bit when people from other markets say, Singapore is this or Singapore is that, because at least everybody that I've met said, I love being in Singapore, and I'm speaking as a non-Singaporean. But we've chosen to make Singapore our home because I think it's a great place to live and a great place to raise kids. So I'm kind of scratching my head saying, what do you want? So not to be too philosophical, but I have a daughter that goes to university in the US, and am I more comforted that she's in the US, in the land of the free and home of the brave, but I'm always worried about her getting a taxi home at night or where she is after dark, whereas I wasn't when she was here? I don't know.
More questions from the floor. Hand in the center. Mike, coming to you.
I think innovation requires, in my experience, a culture of willingness to challenge, willingness to stand out. And I think some of that starts with our education. And are we encouraging our students to challenge? Are we encouraging our students to think differently and challenge norms? And I'm wondering, is that something that we are doing enough in Singapore to try and get this culture of innovation?
Clearly, we're identifying three villains today. Parents, schools, and bankers. But no, taking that point, education, anybody to add? I love your idea about the campus and the university and the structure there and those ideas that could be inputted. Are we missing out something else besides that gestalt effect that could happen?
Well, SUTD is one example. SUTD trying to bring together technology and design. So more to do, but yeah.
But by the time they become university students, they may have been damaged in the process along the way by parents or teachers. You know,
HDB prices, COE.
Let me just give you an example. I ran an art competition. Okay, this is about creativity on giving. You know, getting school children, primary school children, to draw. You know, the expression of what giving is. Because I come from the National Volunteer Philanthropy Center. This was a couple of years ago, and I was helped by a lecturer, a professor from NAFA, LaSalle School of Art, and he was judging the competition. And this is about creativity, right? And just putting the paintings on the floor, he could just pick out a few and say, I'll throw this aside. And I said, well, I mean, my staff said, but it looks perfectly fine. It looks quite beautiful. And he says, no, I can see that there is a hand of the teacher in these paintings. And in fact, when you turn over the page where the names of the artists and the school they are from, they all came from the same school. Okay, and so we're teaching creativity, but within a structure, and people are taught never to think for themselves, and that's my worry. We may think that we are allowing people to do things that are creative, but they are still boxed in our system.
But I think it's a very, it's not a philosophical point, it's an action point. How far does the education system want to encourage kids to be non-conventional, to challenge the teachers, to challenge the knowledge that is being thrown to them? And I like to believe that the most revolutionary subject you can teach is mathematics. Because mathematics is a place where you say 2 plus 2 equals 4. By the way, why is that? Can we imagine a world in which 2 plus 2 is not equal to 4? This is the right way of teaching mathematics. If this is done, then you encourage questioning everything. And it's much easier to do with science than it is with philosophy, let's say. In philosophy, you say, there's one way of thinking which is this way, other philosophers have thought that way. You compare existing bodies of languages. But it's very, very difficult for a 10-year-old or a 15-year-old to imagine their own philosophy. They can imagine their own science, they can imagine their own mathematics. Can we think of a world in which 2 plus 2 equals 5? Yes, we can, and there are consequences to that. You may show that these consequences would not make a very coherent world to live in, but intellectually it's feasible. So if that kind of teaching takes place, we would be able to address a critical issue we have right now all over the world, which is about introducing technology in the classroom. Because technology makes teachers uncomfortable by nature. It has been said a long time ago that science is what grandfathers and grandmothers can teach to their grandchildren, and technology is the other way around. And this is very, very true in the classroom. As soon as you introduce tablets or any other equipment, there's a superiority of the kids over the teachers, and that will make them uncomfortable. We see all over the world that the main obstacle, the main source of failure of introducing technology in the classroom is the teachers. Then the families, the parents, and third, only the kids. Kids generally grab it very quickly. So don't introduce technology in schools until you have educated the educators on what can secure their authority, how they still have knowledge to share with the kids.
And that they will still have a job and not be outsourced.
That's another aspect of
That's
it.
another one. I've got my last minute and a half. Very quickly, just want to go across the table. Your wish list. What is your one thing that you would want to change here and now to help foster innovation in Singapore? I'll start with you, Lawrence, if I may.
I think the first thing to work on is mindsets. The mindsets of people. I think people need to feel it's cool to be an innovator, to be an entrepreneur.
Urs, I know you've not got much experience in Singapore, but what is the one thing you would want to change to foster innovation?
What I learned today is I think the mind change is really the most important thing, to be more risk takers.
Bruno?
Again, one mistake we made about innovation all over the world has been to think that it's about brains. It's about minds, clearly. So encouraging diversity, encouraging different ways of thinking, comparing them, sorting them out, saying, I don't like this drawing because, etc., is part of the game. But diversity, the gender balance in this panel is a very encouraging sign, will help innovation.
And cafeterias. And cafeterias. Yeah. Last word with you, Steve.
Confidence. It's building on the same thing, but confidence within parents that kids can try something and see how. There's always a job around the corner. There's zero unemployment effectively. Confidence in the kids to give it a try. I think the greatest thing is whenever somebody wants to talk about how many degrees and how many of this and that, I always go back to some of the biggest companies in the world were not built by people that have 2 or 3 or 4 degrees. So it's okay to try something. There's always an opportunity to exit out, meaning go back and, to Lawrence's point, get a job in a bank or whatever you want to do. There's plenty of opportunities. So just have confidence for us to communicate that it's good to have confidence to try something. It's good for the parents to have confidence. It's good for the teachers to have confidence. Just having confidence that it will work out for almost everybody, almost all of the time, and one way or the other. And let's not worry so much about taking some risk.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us under the big tent. A round of applause, please, for our panel.